We'll just start by introducing ourselves. I'm David Markwell. I'm the Intellectual Property and Commercialisation Manager for both the Western City Local Health District and the Sydney Children's Hospital Network. I have 10 years of experience in commercialising research outcomes in a variety of different roles and from various research organisations, including universities, public hospitals and medical research institutes. My background's in biotechnology and technology and innovation management. Prior to commercialisation, I worked in some technical roles in some smaller molecular diagnostics companies and genetic service providers. And I've been here at the Westmead precinct for 5 years, and it's quite exciting now to see that we have a hub commercialisation team with managers spanning 5 of the different research hub partners here.
And I'm Nadia Pece-Barbara, and I work as a commercial theme leader for the University of Sydney with commercial development and industry partnerships. What that basically means is I'm a commercialization manager as well, representing the University of Sydney, but I'm actually physically here, and I also represent the Westmead Institute on their commercialization matters. In a previous life, I was a research scientist, and I did do my PhD at the University of Toronto in immunology in Canada, and I also did a postdoc as well from in Canada, and then moved here about 13 years ago and went into patent law. So I'm also a registered patent attorney, and I worked in patent attorney firms for about 10 years and worked for a number of commercial partners, managing their intellectual property, protecting intellectual property for a number of commercial entities as well as universities and research institutes. And I've now made the leap back into the research arena. And I'm very much interested in helping protect the intellectual property that comes out of the Westmead precinct as well as the Westmead Institute, and bringing back research dollars from companies back in to the Westmead Institute particularly. Go.
I'm Julia Hill. I'm the Head of Commercialisation for the Children's Medical Research Institute. I also started life as a bench scientist, have a PhD in embryology, did postdocs in Europe and in the US, came back to Australia, and I did an MBA. For the last 18 years, I've been working in many aspects of the commercialisation process, from within research institutes and universities, from within startup companies and even some public listed companies, and I've also worked on the investment side in venture capital. Now, the common theme across all of my roles has been that I've always been involved in early stage technologies, and that's where I like to be. To me, that's where the really exciting stuff happens.
So I'm just going to start by providing a brief overview of our intellectual property and commercialisation seminar series. We've currently got 2 seminars scheduled, and we're planning to roll out further seminars throughout the year. So in today's seminar, we're going to provide an introduction to intellectual property and commercialisation. We've introduced the team, how it can help you, an overview of our commercialisation processes. We're going to provide some case studies and also try and dispel some of the common misconceptions that people have about intellectual property and commercialisation. Then in our second seminar in 2 weeks' time, we're going to really take a deeper dive into protecting, managing and leveraging your intellectual property, and that'll be delivered together with some patent attorneys from Freehills Patent Attorneys. We then have a seminar planned to cover contracts and agreements, and the date's yet to be locked in for that one. And then we have some other seminars planned, but we are open to suggestions on topics that are relevant to intellectual property and commercialisation that you might like to learn more about. So firstly, research commercialisation, what is it? If you were to look up the definition of commercialisation, you might find definitions like the process of managing or running something principally for financial gain, or the process of introducing a new product into commerce. I don't think these definitions really fit very well for research commercialisation. I think in the context of research organisations, we're really talking about the process of managing the transfer of research outcomes to broad market applications. And successful commercialisation really involves the transfer of both knowledge and intellectual property to industry, who can then convert that intellectual property and knowledge into new or improved products and services. So why do we go about commercialising? I think a big motivation for many of you is probably increasing research impact, the satisfaction of bringing a new product or service to broader market application, where it really provides a benefit for society. And I think as a research community, we really have a moral obligation to ensure that the substantial investment of government funds into research ultimately translates into benefits for society. There's also a variety of alternative funding sources available for commercialisation. There's sponsored research and development, where a company will provide funding into a research organisation to undertake research with a specific project plan and with specific deliverables out of that project. There's also translational grant funding opportunities through programs like the NH and MRC Development Program, ARC linkages, CRC projects. And then there's some core commercialisation grants available through sources like Accelerating Commercialisation or the New South Wales Medical Device Fund. And then finally, there's investment funding available into startup companies from some of the seed funds that are accessible to us locally here. Another incentive for commercialisation is if something is successfully commercialised, both the inventors and their department receive a share in any commercial proceeds that flow back to the organisation. And that actually provides a source of funding that doesn't have the same strings attached as traditional grant funding. And finally, there's personal gain, both potential financial gain and relative autonomy by having some alternative funding sources that aren't reliant on the competitive grant funding cycle. In terms of raising your academic and professional profile, research publications aren't the only measure of research impact, and increasingly universities and government funding bodies are starting to measure commercialisation activities as part of your individual and professional profiles. And then finally, there's also expanded career options available and enhanced employability from commercialisation. So I'd firstly like to say not everything should be patented, and for some forms of knowledge transfer, publication is absolutely the best means to get it out there. But for anything that relies on substantial development and validation, having a defendable IP position is absolutely critical to being able to translate innovations into practical application. Industry simply will not invest if they don't have a defendable position, both through product development and at the end. And I think probably the most extreme example here is if you take drug development. Well, the average cost of bringing a new drug through development to market is in excess of $1.7 billion and takes on average 11 years of development. No company is willing to make that investment without having a period of market exclusivity at the end where they can make a return on investment. And intellectual property is what provides them with that market exclusivity at the end. And I think we've seen a lot of cases here at the Westmead precinct where there's been really promising research projects that have been grant funded into preclinical development and sometimes even into early clinical development, where we've reached a point where we just can't develop the technology any further because intellectual property hasn't been secured in the early stages, or in other cases it may have been disclosed through research publications prior to it being registered. And so we're really hoping that we can change that by raising awareness of intellectual property and commercialisation and providing you with advice at early stages in your research programs to manage your IP so you're better placed to commercialise it later on. I'm going to now hand over to Nadia to talk further about intellectual property.
So David makes a valid point that commercialization cannot occur without IP. So let's take a step back a bit and think about what is IP. Very basically, IP is property that is generated through intellectual or creative activity. It's not only about creating new things like products, devices, processes, or methods, but it's also about improving or modifying existing ones. This creation of IP leads to the generation of IP rights, which can also be referred to as IP outputs. As you can see, there's a number of different IP outputs that you as researchers may produce. Some rights are registrable, such as patents, trademarks, or designs, through a formal process. Uh-oh. Come back, okay. Whilst others are automatic, like copyright. This also shows and describes IP outputs such as know-how, confidential information, or trade secrets, which are equally as valuable to an industry partner, but they may not be immediately obvious forms of IP. I won't get into the details of how these IP rights differ now and how you would go about registering a patent and so on and so forth, because I encourage you to come to our next seminar that will be delivered by FPA. What I'd like to emphasize today is that it's important for you to know about IP to ensure that you understand where you are generating IP, but also to understand how important it is. Researcher innovations can lead to the generation of IP, which is an asset. This is an asset that is very similar to property. IP can be sold, it can be licensed, or it can be exchanged. IP facilitates collaboration, and this can be summarized using the 3 E's. Exclusivity, enabling, and engaging. It's exclusive, and it creates value. It's a bargaining tool for selling, because no one else but your potential partner will have access to your innovation, your knowledge, and your expertise. It's enabling because it brings negotiations to focus. Everyone knows what's on offer. And they're going to be, they know what they're going to be licensing, selling, or using. It will drive investment in your innovation. If everyone has access to your innovation, what's in it for the industry partner? It also provides a quality control because it allows the researcher to exercise influence over whatever the product or process is. It's engaging because you can use well-defined innovations to engage and collaborate with other researchers, academics at your university, your institute, as well as other universities, and with research and of course with industry. I cannot emphasize enough that IP creates impact. IP and the transfer of IP knowledge is an indicator for engagement, impact, and innovation, and it creates a track record for your NHMRC grants. What you should know about ownership of IP here at the Westmead Research Hub is that by virtue of the number of entities that there are here, there's a lot of joint IP created. IP ownership is governed by employment contracts, IP policies, and IP agreements. But what you need to know is that we're used to it, and we will get the right agreements in place that are required. However, what I'd like you to take away is to be mindful and respectful of others' IP, because if you don't own it, make sure you can use it freely. And what that might mean is you might want to check with us. If you do create IP and your employer, your institute, or your university owns that IP or all of the above, you will get a commercialization share. Again, this will be determined upon which IP policy you may fall under and the nature of how you are conducting your work here. So I'd just like to introduce you now to the technology transfer process. This is what we do. Broadly speaking, this process involves identifying IP, making the decision to protect it, we then package it, and then we seek to commercialize it by licensing it or creating a spin-out. I'd like you to keep this process in mind from the outset, because I will delve into the early phases of the process just by a way of introduction here, and then Julia will provide a little bit further information on the later stages. We will provide further in-depth seminars at some point on the various aspects of this process at a later date. So let's look first at the pre-disclosure stage, as this is where a lot of the work that is happening on your end as researchers. What are some of the things that you need to consider? You need to be mindful of the Research Code of Conduct, and importantly, you need to have good record-keeping practices. This is important to us as well, because if there is any IP dispute, if there is any IP dispute, we may need you to provide these records at a later date. You may also need to consider some conflicts of interest. So you need to have a look at your external interest policies and what external interest policy you might fall under. And we can also help you with navigate through that. If you're collaborating with external parties, you should ask yourself early, do I need a contract? Why do I need a contract? So this slide is pretty self-explanatory. It's just giving you some of the points as some of the things that you should know or keep in mind when asking yourself, do I need a contract? So I'd like to just touch upon some of the legal agreements which you might want to consider at the pre-disclosure stage. Let's just have a brief look at some of these. A confidentiality agreement is important to protect your confidential information when you're dealing with an external party. A material transfer agreement is important if you're using materials from an external lab or if they're using yours. Research agreements come in many forms, and it's not important about the title of the contract, it's the nature of activity that matters. They're important for dealing with use and ownership of each party's IP, any new IP created, as well as funding. The difference with industry contracts is that the funding is from industry, which will be considered along with perhaps options to license. I'd like to really emphasize engage with us early, but we will have a session on contracts and agreements, as David's already mentioned. So what is really important for you to take home here is that if you think you have something worth protecting, engage with us early. Provide us with an invention disclosure form, or at least come and talk to us about it. It's important to know that the timing is key. We would like you to do this before any public disclosure, for example, an abstract, a presentation, a publication. This is very important. If you disclose your invention publicly, it'll be very difficult for us to get a patent. So that we would really like to hit that home, come see us early. And I'd like to also backtrack there too. If you do come to us early, there won't be delays on your patent publications because we're able to take that through while you're submitting for your patent publication. Or sorry, for your research publications. So at the next phase, we will take it through a patentability assessment. We will do market assessment. We will review any associated agreements and make sure that the IP isn't encumbered. And we will look at ownership considerations of the IP. We do all that to take it to the next step and decide whether or not it should be formally protected. Usually a decision to formally protect the IP is made by an IP committee, and we present the case to the IP committee. You may be asked to go back and do a few more experiments because there might not be enough data to actually protect by way of a patent. So what I'd like to say about that is that if you've got enough data for a publication, that's generally a good rule of thumb. You'll have enough for a patent. We then take care of the formal paperwork, and as I've said, the interinstitutional agreement will likely be required for most people here because there will be a number of entities involved in owning the IP that you create. I'd like to now pass on to Julia, who's going to talk a little bit more about the next steps in the patenting process and typical routes for commercialization.
Thanks, Nadia. So Nadia's taken you through the steps to actually getting to the point of putting in a patent application. Getting a patent granted is actually quite a lengthy process. It takes place over a number of years, and there's a lot of steps involved and a lot of costs involved. We're not going to talk about that today because the patent attorneys will take you through all of that and the different types of patents in the next seminar. But the important thing at this point to understand is that once that patent application has been lodged, the clock is ticking. It's ticking in terms of time to get additional data in for your full patent application, which occurs 12 months after the provisional patent application goes in. The clock is ticking in terms of your patent life, which is where the value comes for your industry partner. It's also ticking in terms of finding that industry partner before the costs start to escalate. As the patent process proceeds, the costs increase exponentially. Okay, so how do we go about this? Well, we need to find an industry partner sooner rather than later. And the typical routes to commercialisation, which I'm going to touch on today, typically involve an industry R&D contract, which can have an option to a licence or an actual licence to intellectual property. There are licensing scenarios and there are startup companies. R&D contracts with an industry partner typically have an option to license the intellectual property or an actual license to the intellectual property. The research plan is very much like a research plan in your grant, and you have timelines, you have milestones, you have a budget. Typically there'll be a research committee formed to oversee the program of work. There will be representatives from each party, so there'll be representatives from the Institute, there'll be representatives from the industry partner, and if there's additional institutes involved, there'll be representatives from those as well. So everyone has a fair say in overseeing the progress of the work. There's two types of intellectual property that get considered in R&D contracts. That's background IP, which is intellectual property that you bring to the table at the start of the arrangement. That has a lot of bargaining power, gives you a lot of bargaining power if you have some background IP. There isn't always background IP, but inevitably the research program results in project IP. And so there is a license around the terms for dealing with that project IP. So what do we mean by a license? So a license grants another party the right to commercialise your intellectual property in consideration for a share in the revenues. Licenses can take a number of forms. Typically they tend to be exclusive, which means only one person or one party can have a license to your intellectual property. Sometimes, depending on the nature of the technology, they can be non-exclusive and there can be multiple parties exploiting it. Field of use is another area that we give consideration to. So you might have some compounds that have potential applications in a number of different disease areas. We can give a license around one particular disease area and leave the other ones free for another more suitable partner. Territory is talking about which part of the world you've put your patents in, which part of the world you're licensing to. So a Japanese pharmaceutical company might only need license for Japan, and you might have the rest of the world to license to other people. Licenses typically are made up of two lots of revenues, milestone payments and royalties. Typically there'll be an upfront fee which gets you started. It's a nice payment at the beginning of the license. Milestone payments, in the case if we take drug development as an example, milestone payments will occur on events such as the commencement of various phases of clinical trials, or sometimes it's on completion of the clinical trial, other times it can be upon recruitment of a certain number of patients into a clinical trial. Regulatory approvals are another milestone that attracts substantial milestone payments generally. So you might have a payment when you get FDA approval, when you get TGA approval, when you get EU approval. And then further down the track, once there's a product on the market, licensing agreements can sometimes include milestones that are around sales. So it might be on the first sale in a particular market, such as the EU or the US, or it might be on cumulative sales. So when you reached $100 million of sales, you get $5 million, something like that. The other form of revenue is royalties. Royalties are paid on the finished product when it goes to market. The royalties are typically for the term of the patent, and this is where patent life becomes really important, okay? Sometimes royalties can be negotiated for areas that are not patented or for outside of patent terms, but royalties can either be a flat rate or they can be tiered. So they might be a certain rate up to a certain amount of sales and then another rate after that. So finally, the other obvious route of commercialisation is for a university or a research institute to establish a new entity, a startup company. What happens with startup companies is that the IP is usually either assigned outright to the company, so the company will own it, or it might be licensed from the research institute to that entity. I think it's really important to understand that companies can take on many forms, particularly when it comes to the involvement of scientists. I have had some scientists say, oh, I don't want to go down the commercialisation path because I want to remain an academic. That's okay, you can do both. Sometimes the companies will be virtual in that most of the R&D is done by contract back to R&D institutes. Sometimes they'll have an internal R&D team. I have seen, when I was at CSIRO, we had one example where the scientist was seconded to the startup company for 12 months to help set up that R&D team, and then he went back into CSIRO. So there's many ways to skin a cat. You can have your academic career and you can have your intellectual property be commercialised through a startup route. There's always a dedicated management team, and it's rare that the scientist is involved in that management team, but there is nearly always a scientific advisory board, which the founding scientists will play a large role in. Fundraising becomes a major focus and very time consuming. So sometimes it's preferable to license IP than to have all of the time taken up on fundraising. And in terms of ownership, typically an institute is either a shareholder or it receives licensing fees from the licensed IP into the startup company. So now we're going to we've touched on a lot today, briefly, because we're going to have follow-up seminars that will delve into each aspect in more detail. But now we just want to give you some case studies.
So for our first case study, I'm going to provide an overview of the Hemologics deal, and this was a commercialisation deal that we entered into last year. And I think this is a fantastic example of a commercialisation deal involving 4 different entities, 4 different research hub partners here at Westmead. So the project was led by Dr. Ken Micklethwaite and Professor David Gottlieb, and it was a collaboration with an immuno-oncology company called Hemologics to develop new CAR T-cell therapies for multiple myeloma. And the project was initially funded out of a New South Wales Cancer Council funded grant, and this led to the development of some novel therapeutic constructs, and a patent application was filed. Now, the intellectual property was owned by 5 different organisations: Hemologics, the Westmead Institute, the University of Sydney, the Children's Medical Research Institute, and the Western Sydney Local Health District. So initially we established a co-ownership agreement between the 4 research entities, and this allowed a single party to take the lead in commercialising the IP, and that was Western Sydney Local Health District in this case. And for the company, then that provided a single entity for them to deal with, which was important. Ultimately, the commercialisation rights were assigned to the company, and the research institutes have a share in future proceeds from milestones and commercial and royalties from sales. I think very importantly, there was also a research contract which came back to the Westmead Institute to continue, both for staff and consumables, to continue research and development of the technology, and that's something we really like to try and do with licensing type deals. For the next case study, I'm going to present Semaxis, which is an orthopedic implant for children with brittle bone disease and non-union fractures. And this was a technology developed by Professor David Little and Justin Bobbin in kids research here at the Children's Hospital Westmead. And the Semaxis is an implantable device that grows with a child's bone while also retaining rotational stability. And this reduces the complications which are associated with existing devices, and also the number of revisions and surgeries that children require. This one's an exceptionally quick example of a commercialisation journey from filing a provisional patent application to reaching a license agreement. So in January 2014, a provisional patent application was filed, and we began marketing the technology to companies. In March 2014, we had an expression of interest from an international orthopedic device company. And at the same time, we prepared a funding application for the New South Wales Medical Device Fund. In June 2014, a term sheet was negotiated, and shortly after we began negotiating and drafting the licensing agreements. In October that year, the project was awarded a New South Wales Medical Device Fund grant of $705,000. That was really to allow the further development of the device. And then shortly after that, in December 2014, the license agreement was executed with the device company. And this product's now been in development over the last 4 years with a local manufacturer, and we're hoping the product will be launched later this year or early next year, where it'll ultimately start benefiting patients. And I'll hand over to Nadia for the next case study.
I'd just like to briefly talk about a success story, a recent success story out of the University of Sydney. Professor Anthony Weiss developed his skin repair treatment at the University of Sydney in his biochemistry lab, and that was back in the 90s. He then co-founded the company called SCHN in about 2005, but this was now recently sold this year and acquired by the company Allergan for $120 million. So I'd like to also say that that with that deal, there will be further paydays when the treatment passes clinical trials, pretty much along the lines of what Julia already mentioned, when they gain a regulatory control approval, and when the actual product goes on sale to cosmetic surgeons. This was one of the largest recent transactions for Australian life science sector. What I'd like to emphasize, though, is that Professor Anthony Weiss, he is an inventor. He holds 43 international patents and within 17 different patent families, but he also has a very active laboratory still at the University of Sydney. His laboratory is the leading research site for tropoelastin and synthetic elastin biomaterials. So it's not impossible to do both. I'll now pass it on to Julia.
I just want to leave everyone with something that you may have heard about last year that came out of the WIHI. It was a landmark licensing deal for medical research institutes globally, not just Australia. and it really demonstrates what can be done and gives us all something to truly aspire to. So I'm not sure if I say the name right, venetoclax. The basic science around that was actually done by a PhD student in 1988. Basic research project in a lab as a PhD student. Last year in July, after the drug had finally been approved, WIMR sold off a part of their rights, only a part of their rights, for $250 million US upfront, and another potential $75 million US in milestones. That's a lot of grant funding. The collaborators and partners were two companies, Genentech and AbbVie, and the drug blocks BCL2 proteins. So BCL2 proteins are suppressors of apoptosis, and that's the discovery that was initially made back in 1988. So let's take a look at this 29-year timeline. The basic research took place over a period of 18 years, and there was a series of teams involved in that basic research. It wasn't one team that took it all the way through. In 2006, the first compound that actually blocks BLC2 was discovered and patented, and it was fairly promptly licensed to a Roche company called Genentech. A year later, Genentech introduced another company, AbbVie, probably because of the very large costs involved in drug development that we've already seen, but I'm sure there was expertise that was required all around as well. And the collaboration became three-way. The WIMR was still involved. In 2009, the lead compound, which went on to be venetoclax, was developed and tested. The drug development and industry partnering, that took 5 years. Then the next 6 years, which is actually relatively quick for drug discovery clinical trials. The first clinical trial was in 2011 here in Australia. Results were finally announced in 2013. So I imagine there was a few iterations of that phase 1 clinical trial, which often does happen. Phase 2 clinical trial results were announced in 2016, and in 2017 it was approved in the US, the EU and Australia. So I think that it's this one, and also some of the examples that Nadia and David have shown us, demonstrate that the myth that I hear a lot of people saying, I do basic research, I don't need to know about commercialisation. It's not always the case. Basic research does lead to intellectual property that can become very valuable products, saving lives. Another thing that often puts people off is the belief that patenting will delay publications. That doesn't have to be the case. And it all comes back to Nadia's point of working with us, engaging with us early. If you've got a publication that's being submitted to a journal, we can take that publication at the same time as you submit it, take it to the patent attorneys, they can lodge the patent before that becomes public property. Okay, so you'll have your patent before the paper's published. Academia and patenting are mutually exclusive. I think we've seen, and I think most people in this room probably know that really isn't the case. And in terms of the time involved, I'm not going to say that any of this is easy and it doesn't take time. It isn't, and it does. But we can save a lot of time by working together from the early stages. And just to take you back to David's point at the beginning as to why it's important to be conscious of intellectual property, it's the timelines involved in bringing a lot of our research to the market. It's the money involved. The industry partners need that exclusivity. They need that barrier to anybody else coming in to exploit it.